Hello and welcome to this first unit on intercultural communication today. You can pause these presentations at any point. There are also notes in PDF format. What's meant by intercultural communication? This is how we communicate successfully with people who are different from us in fundamental ways. They might look different, they might have different worldviews, religions, behaviors, language. What does it take to be successful in encounters with people from different cultures? One can point to three particular attributes. One is knowledge, knowing about that other culture, and therefore not falling back on cliches and stereotypes. One is skills, for example, learning a second language. And one is attitudes, being motivated to want to actually communicate with people from different cultures. Why is it important? Well, we hear a lot about globalization that often refers to business, the fact that there are lots of international companies today doing business in many different countries. But also there's increased travel, much easier and less expensive today. Communication has been enhanced through the arrival of the internet and other means of communication. And of course, it's important in today's world to try to deal with some of the conflicts that arise in many parts of the world that are based on a lack of knowledge and understanding and acceptance of peoples, of cultures, of worldviews that are different from our own. This is particularly true in countries where there are large immigrant communities that sometimes are not readily accepted into the mainstream culture. There's this term global village that was coined by Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s that refers to this kind of globalization, the fact that communities everywhere are less likely to be isolated than used to be the case. One points often to the internet. This is not available everywhere in the world, but certainly growth has been significant in recent decades. That's true as well for cell phone usage, which is much more widespread than is internet access. Social networking has brought people from different cultures together. Facebook, for example, is available not just in the English-speaking world, but throughout the world. There are other kinds of social networks as well available. One should be cautious, however, about the internet because of the existence of what's sometimes called the echo chamber, the fact that often our search results in Google, for example, tend to be filtered. There's this term filter bubble that's sometimes used, are filtered according to what we've searched for and clicked on in the past. And so this is true in Facebook as well, that the news feeds tend to reflect what we've looked at in the past, the kinds of friends that we tend to follow. And this can lead to this kind of echo chamber that reflects the knowledge and the group of people that we're used to dealing with, the ideas that we tend to espouse, and so less likelihood of encountering new ideas or new people. The United States is an example of the growing diversity throughout the world. The fact that by 2042, the U.S. population will go from 60% white, which is what it was in the 2000 census, to 50% or less, with a particular growth in the fastest growing minority group, Latinos or Hispanics, from 15% in 2000 to 25%. This is echoed in a variety of countries, this kind of growing diversity. What are the benefits of intercultural communication? Personal growth, obviously. We become more knowledgeable, more accepting of other cultures, healthier communities. There are a number of countries that have declining birth rates. Russia, Japan, Germany, France, bringing in immigrant communities is important for growth. Reduced conflict is an obvious benefit. And one I would point to as particularly important today, as we're seeing the growth of fringe political parties that don't accept immigrant communities, is to have leaders who are tuned and accepting of diversity in all its manifestations. One of the real benefits, and one of the things that I hope students will get out of this class, of intercultural communication is learning more about your own culture and your own background. There are particular fields in which intercultural communication is especially important. Business world is one that we've mentioned already. In the health professions in the United States, it's very helpful to know Spanish, something about culture of Latin America, dealing with patients. Education, we're seeing increasingly in elementary schools throughout the world that you have a mix of cultures and languages represented. The tourist industry, obviously, as well. As an academic discipline, intercultural communication is fairly recent, started in after World War II. One points often to Edward Hall's seminal book, The Silent Language, but there are a number of disciplines that are represented. In particular, one can point to the importance of cultural anthropology, communications, and linguistics. What is culture? We're going to be using a working definition from Jim Neulib of culture as an accumulated pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by an identifiable group of people with a common history and verbal and nonverbal symbol systems. There are lots and lots of definitions of culture, but that's the one that we'll be using for this class. It's important to realize that culture is not static. It's fluid, it's changing, it's dynamic. National cultures, for example, change in reaction to dramatic events like natural disasters or wars. They can change also in contact with other cultures. So it's not something that's static. One points sometimes to the so-called paradox of culture, that it's there and has a determining effect on our beliefs, our values, our behaviors, but it's not something that we're necessarily aware of. It can be invisible. The symbol that's often used is an iceberg, that there are things above the water, above the surface, that we see of a culture, the cultural artifacts, the appearance, how people are dressed, how they wear their hair, what they like in terms of music, movies, food. There's, of course, the language that's immediately evident, nonverbal communication. But there are lots of things beneath the surface that are even more important to know about the cultural values, the belief systems, where these cultures are coming from. And one can also point to things that are universal that aren't necessarily part of a distinctive culture, that are common to all humans. The need, for example, for security, the need for safety, and similar kinds of universal human needs. One of the things that's often done in courses on intercultural communication is to find ways to compare cultures. And a lot of this is work based on the work done in the 1950s and 60s by Hall, and also a Dutch scholar, Geert Hofstede, who who did a survey of IBM employees throughout the world. So we're going to be talking about these very briefly. The one that's used most often to categorize cultures is this idea of individualism versus collectivism, with the sense that individualism refers to societies in which individuals are brought up to be very assertive of their individuality, to be creative and self-reliant, and where group memberships tend to be fairly shallow. That is to say that in individualistic cultures we belong to a good number of groups, but these can be very fleeting relationships and not of great importance. Collectivistic cultures, individuals brought up to have a sense of duty to the group, to the in-group, and cultures in which harmony is valued for the society as a whole and for individual behavior, and where groups tend to take on more importance. They tend to be longer lasting, not just the family, but also work groups, for example. Power distance is another one of these cultural taxonomies that's used, that refers to the importance or lack of importance of hierarchies in a particular culture. So with small, so-called small power distance cultures tend to minimize inequalities. So example typically would be European countries or the United States. Countries with large power distance accept and expect that not everybody is going to be treated the same. And so inequality is accepted and even seen as something desirable. Time orientation is something else that's often used to compare cultures. You have the so-called M-time cultures, monochronic orientation, where being on time, keeping to schedules is very important. Dealing with one thing at a time is the norm, as opposed to polychronic or P-time orientation, where time is seen as much more fluid. Being on time is not a high priority, and handling different tasks and dealing with different people at the same time is seen as acceptable, in fact desirable. And these different time orientations have obviously an effect on scheduling. They can also have an interesting effect on space, on physical space. If you wanted to deal with one thing, only one thing at a time, you want space divided up into cubicles, into offices, with ability to close door, as opposed to a large open space where you can deal with a variety of people at the same time. And that has an effect, obviously, on business practices as well. Another kind of category that's used is what's called uncertainty avoidance, the degree to which cultures, people in particular cultures, feel uncomfortable with ambiguous or uncertain situations, and the extent to which they try to avoid those situations. One should approach the use of these different taxonomies with caution. It's not the case that culture is necessarily, that one's individual culture is necessarily tied tightly to the national culture in which one grew up. One might belong to a minority group, a microculture, Hispanics, for example, in the United States, depending on the nature of their family, their personal choices, might have a different perspective, a different set of values from Black Americans, from African Americans. It's also the case that cultures are not permanent, they change. And of course, people have individual choices that they can make. So there are lots of different things that contribute to individual identity, and this is going to be, in fact, the main topic for our next unit.